Hello, I'm David Matthews, and welcome to our book study. Today we begin our study looking at Dallas Willard's book, Hearing God. In chapter 1, Dallas Willard looks at the paradox of hearing God's voice. Beginning, he shares an anecdote of his wife's grandmother, how she looks at a pastor sharing a story and says, "How come I never hear God that way?" We all want to hear God. That's the paradox. Our greatest desire is to hear God's voice, and yet he seems to speak so infrequently, if at all, to us. Dallas Willard, in his study, attempts to make this clear and help us to understand this paradox, and consequently, how we can understand God through this paradox. Dallas Willard begins by pointing out a couple of the difficulties and things we must overcome. The first step to a solution, he says, is that we must understand that God's communication comes to us in many different forms. God speaks to us through people, God speaks to us through ancient wisdom of the past, and yes, he speaks to us through his Spirit today. And he's going to unpack these things in future chapters. The second thing is that we must understand is that we may come to God with wrong motivations seeking to hear from him. If I'm just seeking my own profit and wondering which stocks go up and down for my own gratification and wealth, well, then likely I'm not to hear of God's voice, because that's not what God is seeking. The next thing we must understand is that we have the possibility of misconstruing or misunderstanding God's nature, and therefore that might block us from hearing him. In other words, if I only want to hear what I want to hear, if I'm only willing to hear what I want to hear, I may be unwilling to listen to God's voice. If I am living in a sinful and awful way, hurting the people around me and destroying the creation of God, well then God might be less inclined to speak to me, because if he does, it might therefore be promoting or giving allowance to the way I'm living, in my mind at least. Therefore, that might also be a roadblock to us in hearing God's voice. At the end of each chapter, Dallas Willard lays out some questions for us to have some reflection upon. I'm going to share with you in the next video some of those questions, or I should say all of those questions, and some of the responses that our book study had to them. Thank you for joining us.